Join me, Charlotte Stallworth, Vice President of Business Development and Innovation at Stanford Medicine Children's Health, as we engage the brilliant minds driving change in healthcare, unraveling the mystery behind the next medical innovation. Hi, thanks for joining today's discussion of inequalities in patent inventorship and how increasing equity could increase the number of innovations that benefit our diverse world. I am so excited to welcome our two guests. Lisa Larrimore Ouellette is the Deane F. Johnson Professor of Law at Stanford Law School, and Colleen Chien is the Professor of Law at Berkeley Law. Professor Ouellette and Professor Chien are recognized for their research on patent litigation, intellectual property, and innovation law. Their recent paper, Improving Equity in Patent Inventorship, discusses inequality in the patent system and subsequent policy concerns. Through evaluating disparities in patenting and biased attribution practices, Professor Ouellette and Professor Chien identify policy interventions that could improve the innovator-inventor gaps in patent invention rates. Lisa and Colleen, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
This topic really resonates with me, really work in healthcare innovation and hoping to advocate for equality and inventorship. So I really love this topic. I'm excited about getting started. So Lisa, question number one, could you briefly explain the patent system and highlight why this system is important in generating innovation?
Sure. So the patent system gives inventors an exclusive right over their inventions for 20 years. Meaning that if you are the first person to come up with some invention, you can prevent anyone else from making or selling it for 20 years. And the idea here is that if you didn't have this right, it would be easy for someone else to copy your invention and start selling it and undercutting your profits. And then you might not have as much incentive to have come up with the invention in the first place. So without something like the patent system, the concern is that there would be underinvestment in innovation. I'll note, interestingly, the degree to which the patent system is actually important in generating innovation is quite unclear. There's not actually rigorous evidence that stronger patents increase research investments, much less whether this benefit is large enough to outweigh their costs. And there's lots of scholars thinking about ways to improve innovation policy. But even though the social benefits of patents are somewhat contested, patents definitely have clear benefits for those who are receiving them. And I think it's worth thinking about inequalities in who's receiving those benefits.
Definitely. I agree with that. Colleen, can you provide a brief overview of your paper, Improving Equity in Patent Inventorship?
Sure. So as Lisa mentioned, inventorship is important to those who invent. And while we know that some people become inventors while others do not, we're trying to really address a mystery that we're seeing in the data, which is why is it that female and junior scientists and contributors are more likely to be left off the inventor roles than their male counterparts. So in this paper, we try to consolidate the evidence that this is happening, report on new empirical research regarding what might be going on, and suggest some next steps to try to, as we discuss, improve equity in inventorship. So we're tracing the role of social as well as legal factors, and while we can't conclusively rule out or in particular hypotheses, we're able to leverage work and a bit of our own to try to address what feels like an inequitable result, that women and junior scientists and innovators and authors are less likely to be included on patents than their male counterparts.
I appreciate that. And I wonder if some of that is the education part, or maybe even just the timing and difference between publishing and, creating the invention and moving it forward and filing for the patent, that maybe people, the women and other people, are not aware of what it means to be an inventor on something, and they're just kind of left out as time goes on and maybe somebody moves forward without them. So I think that's pretty interesting kind of thing to consider as well, and maybe the role of education in some of this. So Lisa, could you discuss the key findings, related to patent inequality that your paper is tackling, and maybe if education is a kind of a way to help increase the equity, maybe speak on that a little bit as well?
Sure. Yeah. So our paper is tackling this big problem that there's just huge inequalities in who is getting patents now, including by gender, by race, by income, by geography. I think that many women or people from underrepresented groups who've spent some time in the sciences have experienced this on a anecdotal and personal level. Like Colleen and I both spent some time studying science and engineering before going to law school and saw this firsthand. Like while I was getting my physics PhD, there were only 2 female faculty members out of 40 in the department, and the female PhD students were dropping out of the department at a higher rate. And you see this in national statistics across kind of any measure of innovation or inventorship. So like in the patent system, women are currently only around 13% of patent inventors in the US. And at the current rate of improvement here, it's going to take over 100 years to reach gender parity. And Black Americans are around 3 times less likely than white Americans to be patent inventors. I think one of the most cited statistics here is that if women, racial minorities, and people from low-income background were inventing at the same rate as high-income white men, then the overall innovation rate in the US would quadruple, which I think really starkly illustrates the scale of the problem here. And it's not just a problem with who's getting patents, it's also with getting funded to develop businesses based on those patents. Like in 2022, the companies founded solely by women only got about 2% of total venture capital in the US, which is kind of shocking. So there's huge problems, but I think like not a lot of great evidence on exactly where the causes are. And that's one of the things that Colleen and I are trying to tackle here, because like, some of the educational things we're talking about, like that can be part of it. But there's like a lot of different pieces to figuring out what are the different sources of inequality.
Yeah, that's compelling. And it's interesting to think of, like you were saying a little bit earlier as well, like, being an inventor and innovating are not exactly the same thing, although they're closely related. And it could be that women and minorities are innovating at a rate that is maybe a little bit higher than we see, but the way it's measured, we don't really see it. And then that kind of crossover to inventorship and patents, we don't see because of some factors that are limiting those. So it's really interesting to kind of see the tension between those. Colleen, can you tell us what motivated you to delve into the topic of patent inequality and why it's an important issue?
Well, sure. I mean, I think inequality is one of the defining issues of the day. And so understanding how the patent system is exacerbating or alleviating in it is something I think all people who are studying the patent system should be concerned about. That is to say, its distributional impacts. But the patent system is also motivated in large part by the notion of patent prosperity, that anybody with a good idea can take that idea and get protection on it and then help get it to market and get it developed. And also that this idea of innovating and inventing is an important path to economic mobility. So ensuring that this path is open to all is something to strive for. But I also have personal motivations. I think as a woman of color, I'm also impacted by what is innovated and the scope of innovations being developed, and have a stake in who participates, given its influence on what innovations actually get developed. Because people, as we're increasingly finding out, tend to innovate and develop solutions for the problems that they know about. As a mother to 2 boys, I've also seen my kids participate in competitive STEM activities that, unfortunately, even at the junior and high school levels, have become quite gendered. And so thinking about what factors work towards and against participation, I think, is crucial.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess it goes that, follows from what you're saying, that if more women were involved in innovation, we'd see more, advanced products and solutions for maybe issues impacting women. And that's a key item, especially when you think about healthcare. You're trying to improve equity and equality in healthcare, really thinking about how that kind of upstream innovation impacts, the healthcare that people are receiving. Let's see. So Colleen, your paper notes that disparities in patenting are larger than disparities in other measures of innovation. And you just spoke about STEM. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. I think this, in the paper, we talk about scientific paper authorship, and we see that studies of research teams find that compared to men, women are 13% less likely to be named as authors. So people, even controlling across a lot of different areas, women are 13% less likely to be named as authors. But that statistic is far larger, 58%. In terms of the gap between men and women when it comes to patenting, even controlling for seniority in field. So that's to say, if you have a paper where men and women are both named on it, there's a greater chance that the women will be left off when it comes to patenting. So this is something that we really wanted to hone in on. And I think you mentioned education before, which I think is really important. There's education both sort of on the front end in terms of who enters into STEM pathways, into STEM careers. But what we really want to focus on is conditional on being in the workplace. Even if you are an innovator, you're in an innovative job, you're in a position to innovate. Why is it that only a fraction of women and other sort of minority groups are participating and making that next step into inventing? So this is why we came up, or sort of I came up with this idea of the innovator inventor gap, is to really focus on, let's put aside all the factors that lead to you actually being in place to invent. Let's say once you're actually there, why are some people taking the next step and why aren't others? And what can we do to address that?
It kind of gives me the picture of, two inventors are, side by side, a minority and maybe a traditional inventor, and you're right, or innovator. Why do they not take that next step? And I think education could have something to do with it. And then also understanding the benefits of patenting. And I wonder, in an academic environment and some environments, maybe work environment as well, definitely for publishing, for scientists and researchers, they're publishing, everybody is very focused on that. You know what the criteria are, you're really watching to make sure the paper is published, your name is on it. And I think if people kind of thought about inventorship and patents in the same way as, if they're creating that unique therapeutic or device, and they were following that path and they know what it takes to file a patent. I think as a group, if you're a group of inventors still in the same workplace or another place, you can still be advised by your Office of Technology Licensing, or, even online at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. There's so many ways to get more information. So really thinking about how to fill that person with information as they're moving along the path before they get there, to understand what those next steps are.
I think that instinct is exactly right. And we've done some survey work sort of separately from this paper, and also sort of roundtables to understand what is the awareness of both the patenting opportunity, how you participate in it, but what's also people's own sense of self in terms of, do they see themselves as inventors? Do they see themselves as people who should and deserve and could benefit from being part of the system? I know Lisa also is doing some work, I think, with tech transfer offices to sort of understand what is the culture there and how is that contributing to people's awareness and education. But there is this kind of stark difference. I remember talking to one colleague, and he was mentioning that he was, talking to some of his friends who are working in companies, and he said, "Well, aren't you getting in on this patenting sort of opportunity at your company?" And his colleagues who were, minorities said, "Well, actually, we didn't realize that this was something we should do. But when we talked to some friends of ours, we realized that they were actually paying for their kids' education and college, paying down some of their college expenses by patenting and getting money for that." And it's just awareness, a question of how much do people actually know that this is something they could do, they should do, and they could actually benefit from.
Definitely. Thank you, Colleen. Let's see, Lisa, so why is patent inventorship considered a critical and distinct indicator of innovation in comparison to other measures?
Yeah, I think it's for a lot of reasons. I mean, part of it's the kind of economic reasons Colleen was just talking about, that you can get financial benefits from being named as a patent inventor. I think there's also a lot of just professional and reputational benefits, that being named as a patent inventor, that's something that people put on their CV, put on their LinkedIn page. And there's empirical evidence that patents matter, that it increases the earnings of inventors, it makes them more invested in their work, makes them less likely to leave their employers. And when there's systemic inequality in attribution, then that's going to reinforce disparities in who's getting those kinds of benefits, which can accumulate over a career. So if you're not starting out with being recognized, and you're less likely to end up on further patents, less likely to rise to more highly compensated positions, that where you might be in a better position to create even more innovations. So it can have a kind of long-term lifetime effect.
Yeah, that's, I think, true in a lot of ways where there are inequalities, right? That they're compounded over a lifetime. And I think this is also impactful. I wonder, what do you think of the idea, in certain environments to be like rewarded for innovation? I think innovation is one of those words that we use a lot these days, but and especially in healthcare, we're all trying to be innovative as there are different dynamics and changes in the market. If employees and physicians and, clinical staff, if they were recognized for being innovative, just the same credit you get for publishing, maybe you get credit for patents as well, or attempts to patent, right? We know a lot of those first tries don't work, but at least attempts to do that. And then also kind of like on the regular worker side, like administrative people like myself or IS or housekeeping, when they come up with ideas, they can still get credit on their annual evaluation or performance review. If we as leaders, and we're all kind of empowering and educating everyone at once, leadership as well, to recognize those things, and then the worker to actually move forward and feel empowered to move forward in those areas.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and that's why the kind of survey work that Colleen's doing separately is so important for kind of understanding which people think of themselves as innovators, what makes a person consider themselves in that role, and then also thinking about like what kinds of policy interventions could you do to make more people view themselves as an innovator, as someone who is contributing in that sense. I don't know if Colleen wants to add more on her work in that area.
Well, I would just point out, I think that your instincts are exactly right. And we actually, have asked individual inventors, when you became an inventor, what did that mean to you? So if you go on to the site of this project Lisa and I are working on, diversitypilots.org, and look at the diary, we actually surveyed people and said, what did this mean? And I was really shocked at sort of the impact on people in terms of the way they perceive themselves and the way they were perceived both by their community outside the company as well as inside. These are folks that are already in well-paying jobs that are, engineers and technical staff at good companies. But the additional recognition of being named as an inventor meant a lot to a lot of these folks in terms of understanding that they could contribute something that was new and really move innovation forward. Also, the recognition that they received in the companies. There was one person in particular who was already a senior engineer, but he said getting that patent meant that other people in the company started to look at this particular unit as the go-to source for information and for innovation, as well as external recognition within the community and the family. And those things I think can be hugely motivating, sort of this idea of being seen and how impactful that can be on a person's trajectory.
You're right. Yeah, I agree with that. It's like that incentive. It doesn't always have to be monetary, although there is the business aspect of having a patent, but just being recognized and that really is motivating, because we're all just human people, right? And we need like some kind of like recognition. And I really appreciate what you're saying, and I'd love to take a look at some of that feedback you've collected. I will take a look at that. Could you elaborate on some of the biased attribution practices mentioned in the paper?
Sure, I can take that one on. And if we know anything about bias, we know that it's hard to observe directly, and it's often unconscious. So social scientists have done meticulous work to document implicit bias and how we kind of can understand what's happening cognitively, that it's this automatic and often erroneous association reactions that arise when we encounter a person or a group. And this is documented in a lot of realms. While we don't necessarily have a lot of experimental data, and much less experimental data in the invention setting, I think two of the strongest pieces of evidence I think that were convincing to Lisa and myself were around the disparity, that women and junior authors were disproportionately left off the patents that corresponded with their papers, and that again, even controlling for seniority, experience, and background, women authors were less likely to be named on the patents. And so this to us, I think, points to power dynamics. And as one set of authors have articulated, the omission of people because their contributions tend not to be understood, appreciated, or recognized. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an explicit desire to exclude, but just that the social nature of the process of innovation and the social networks that actually feed into validation of ideas and promotion of ideas also infect the innovation and invention process. And that's what we wanted to try to get at a little bit in this paper.
Yeah, I can see that even in, establish innovation ecosystems that it's very difficult, even for myself, being in this space for, dozens of years, to break into some aspects of the network, right? Because it's like, I don't know, maybe there is some, unconscious bias there. So I think as, minorities and women, we have to continually work on this. But I think as you're educating, I don't want to say the system or the existing ecosystem, that helps to open the doors as well and create those synergies, and with a goal, of course, of impacting, at least on the healthcare space, impacting all people, right? Versus just certain smaller groups. So overcoming this biased attribution, I think is really important. So do we know how these different practices contribute to the observed inequality in the patent system? Excluding marginalized researchers and scientists?
Yeah, I mean, so I should say that, like, the work Colleen was describing on bias in the patent system, like, there's some good empirical evidence on that, but there's also other potential explanations here. And I think one of the things that Colleen and I are doing in this paper is highlighting that, like, even if there weren't bias, there's a second attribution problem that could explain why a female scientist who's on a paper is left off the corresponding patent. And that's that the standards for patent inventorship are not the same as the standards for who gets to be a paper author. And, like, for paper authorship, that will probably be more intuitive to many listeners, that, like, that is governed by scientific norms. It's usually including anyone who's made any kind of important contribution on the paper. But the rules for who gets to be a patent inventor are quite different. Like, patent law has long favored the idea of coming up with an idea over doing the hard work to implement this idea in practice. And that means that to be an inventor, you have to have contributed to that initial idea. That's what patent law calls the conception of the invention.
Yes.
And that means that lots of work that doesn't qualify for authorship often doesn't qualify for inventorship. Like, but there's not tons of litigation over this, but in one prominent case, there were scientists from the National Institutes of Health, NIH, who were held to not be inventors after they had used their cell lines to determine that a new compound was effective against HIV, even though they were the lead authors on the corresponding scientific papers there. So I think that when an author on a scientific paper is left off the corresponding practice, maybe it's a sign of bias, or it could also mean that she couldn't legally have been on the patent because she didn't contribute to a conception and meet that standard. And I think one of the things Colleen and I are trying to do in this paper is to highlight, like, it could be that both of these are right. They're both can be contributing, and it's important to figure out, like, how big a driver of the inequality we're seeing are these different explanations, because the kind of tools you might use for each of them are different.
Yeah, you're right. And there are some dynamics in research labs and things like that, where sometimes the issue is maybe the junior person conceives the idea and is actually the inventor, and there's pressure from the lab manager or the senior scientist to also be named as an inventor when they're not an inventor. So I agree, it's very important to have access, especially in academic healthcare, to our Office of Technology Licensing, but also other support as well, to understand the law of inventorship, right? It's not a popularity contest. There's a law, there's a criteria, and it's black and white. But of course, there are lots of investigations sometimes when there's like confusion there, I'll say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the academic context is a useful place for starting to disentangle these different effects, in that many of the inventions do lead to both a paper and a corresponding patent. So you can start to get a sense of who's contributing in different ways. And, like, one of the main contributions that Colleen and I make in this paper, I think, is empirically starting to get some of the evidence on the effect of these different legal standards, which we don't have good evidence on because usually there's not any independent indication of what kind of contribution was made by a different member of a research team. Like, if you have a junior scientist, like, did they actually contribute to the conception? Should they have been on the patent legally or not? But in the academic context, we are starting to get that because some academic journals are now asking for the contributions of the different authors for a scientific paper to be indicated. So you may have heard of the contributor roles taxonomy, this credit system, which some journals are requiring. So rather than just having the paper authors, you say, okay, well, Colleen contributed to the conception of this idea and the writing of the paper and acquired the funding, and Lisa ran the experiments and did this additional data analysis. And so then you know more specifically what the different authors did. And we were able to use this using a data set with like 30,000 of these articles for which the credit roles were indicated, and show that women authors, they were only 38% of the authors credited with conceptualization, which is, I think, the closest to patent's conception standard. But there were 45% of the authors credited with investigation, which is like actually performing the experiments and collecting data. And that means that like if you had a similar disparity for teams that are working on patentable inventions, then because we're limiting inventorship to just the conceptualizers, that's going to be exacerbating the gender gap. So if you expanded recognition in the patent system so that people who actually do the experiments were also credited for their contribution, then that would boost female recognition by as much as 75% and close the patent gender gap by 10%. So I think that's worth further studies to see if that's really playing an important role.
That would be interesting. So, I mean, if you kind of play that out, that would mean patent law and the kind of rules for who's an inventor would change. And I think the criteria have been in place for hundreds of years. I mean, a long time, right? So, wow.
Yeah, but I think it's worth thinking about. And the rules for who's an inventor are judge made. It's not been hundreds of years, but it's only more recently that as invention has gotten more complicated with more people involved, that judges have actually had to start tackling this, and I think it's worth revisiting.
Definitely. Oh, Colleen, did you want to say something?
Just to build on what Lisa was saying, I think that changing the law would take a lot. There would be, I think development through the case law and judges having to revisit the standard for inventorship. And I think that's something that we, think should be thought about and considered more carefully. But even short of that, we can still take some steps to recognize people who may not rise to the level of inventorship under the current standard, but still have contributed in some significant way. And I think what we're thinking about right now is, whether or not potentially they could be named as contributors or something that's less than an inventor and still get the benefit of being involved in innovation, being recognized. And hopefully that recognition could also lead downstream to their own participation in invention at a more, even as an inventor, at a higher rate. And so I think we're excited about the possibility of, now that there's a lot of people interested in sort of this innovator-inventor gap, and then potentially using that to develop the evidence base for rethinking inventorship.
I love that idea and your approach there. I love like innovating like the process, right? And like kind of like thinking about how to maybe change the rules and the criteria, but also making something else happen and collecting data to help support, the changes. It kind of makes me suddenly, when you were talking, I was thinking about Project Runway. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that show, but sometimes they have group projects and then judges will say, well, who did what, and who conceived the idea, and really everybody tries to get credit, if you're on the winning team. So it's really like kind of trying to think about the categories in which you contributed, even if you just did the sewing or you actually conceived the idea, if it's the winning outfit. So pardon that digression. I don't know if you guys are fans of that show, but yeah, I really like it. And pretty innovative sometimes as well. Let's see. So back to, a question here. Colleen, could you highlight some of the policy interventions that improve the inventor gaps and their potential impact on addressing the patent inequality?
Sure. So I think on the inventorship front, we've already mentioned one idea with respect to what companies could do, but also the PTO could potentially experiment with, which is that, again, even if they themselves can't make the law, that's they're an agency and they sort of apply the law and do the duties that they're allocated. They can still think about what goes on that front page of the patent recognized in association with the patent. So one idea that we've suggested to the patent office is to consider asking applicants when they provide their patents who else potentially contributed to the idea. They may not be inventors, but who else should be still credited with this idea and this invention, and then potentially putting that information into the patent record so that, again, even though the person isn't listed as an inventor, they still get some sort of credit. And we think that companies could do this as well. That anybody who's actually running an invention program can consider this step. But we think ultimately the patent office would have to be the one that would implement this at scale. There are other things the patent office can do with respect to its own administration of the patent system. As you mentioned before, raising awareness and education. That's something that's clearly in their wheelhouse, and they've taken a lot of steps. I have to give a lot of credit to the current PTO director, Kathy Vidal. She's always been very focused on inclusion, even before she was at the patent office. And she has, I think, taken a lot of steps to try to broaden the base of knowledge that is accessible to folks, because frankly, getting a patent is quite an expensive proposition. There's a lot of legal process that goes into it. And so reducing those costs at scale is something that the patent office also can be engaged in and has been. I think on the policy front, I think that's some area in terms of changing the law. That's something I think Lisa and I continue to think about what the evidence base would be for rethinking inventorship or potentially tweaking other standards. Others have suggested, rethinking how we define the ordinary skill in the art and some of these other legal doctrines. And I think we're still thinking about those areas, but certainly steps that the PTO could take right now involve, education, making the process as accessible as possible, and potentially, as we mentioned, giving different types of attribution.
Yeah, definitely. I think, some of the ideas you mentioned is specifically recognizing contributors, even if their contribution doesn't rise to the level of being an inventor. I think that's really important and something that we can adopt, and people who are watching today can adopt locally in their own companies and environments to help, motivate and support innovation in their areas. Definitely appreciate that. Lisa, could you tell us how you would measure the success of the proposed policy interventions in improving equity in patent inventorship?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is just whether an intervention improves the rate of participation in patenting and invention by groups that are currently underrepresented. Like if a company's engineering group is 30% women and their patent applications have only 10% women, then they should be thinking about, are there patent related interventions that would bring that 10% closer to 30%? They might also be thinking about ways to improve the 30%, but like that's a broader problem. And our paper is really focused on that innovator inventor gap. And I think it's important in thinking about these policy interventions that that there be some kind of control group when something is being tested, so that you can really measure the impact of an intervention compared to what would have happened without it. So for example, if you just have a new patent-focused mentorship program, you think that might be helpful. You can't just say, okay, we now have a program, we're going to advertise it, and look, 50% of the women in our program ended up filing a patent. It's a success, because we have no idea like how many of those women would have filed patents without the program. And you can't compare with rates in the broader population, because the women who volunteer for a patent-focused mentorship program are probably more interested in patenting already than the broader population. So there are lots of ways to design a really rigorous real-world policy experiment, all of which take a fair amount of time and effort to do right. But it's really worth that effort, because at the end, you'll know whether the effort of running the intervention is actually worthwhile or whether you should be trying something else.
That's fair. Yeah, I think evidence and, to know how to move forward, it's great to have real world evidence. And I agree, it's tricky to kind of structure the experiments in a fair way to determine what are the best interventions. Colleen, could you tell us the main challenges that may be encountered in trying to close the attribution gaps?
Sure. So, and I did want to mention that if anybody listening or watching this is excited or interested and wants to take the step of potentially trying to provide more recognition, Lisa and I would be very excited to talk to you. And we actually are working with the company now to implement in a rigorous way, as Lisa mentioned, in a randomized control trial, a way to recognize some innovators and understand what the impact of doing that is. So if anybody is interested in that, we would really welcome you're reaching out to us. We'd be really happy to talk to you and brainstorm together how to roll something out, but also then test its impact. But I do think you're right that there are a number of obstacles to sort of addressing inventorship and encouraging this broader participation. And in my mind, there's at least two sets of challenges. I think we've already alluded to them quite a bit. But on the supply side, it's important that innovators understand better the value of being named on an inventor, and they're put on projects where they are positioned to contribute, and they actually know how to participate. And as a survey work that Lisa alluded to suggests, this isn't always the case, that people do not have a uniform understanding. So, and also, it's sort of the time that it takes to participate. That's something that people have to decide they're going to put into the process. But on the demand side, in terms of patent professionals and administrators, they need to ensure that systems are set up in inclusive ways that don't inadvertently exclude folks. For example, we're finding that putting the onus on the innovator to take the initiative, to put themselves out, put themselves in a competitive process, that's not going to be equally appealing to all folks. And so when processes are set up in a more inclusive way, where there's meetings and the question isn't, who has an idea to participate, but what are you working on? Let's think about whether we can move this towards invention. We're finding that those different outreach approaches can yield very different participation. So it is about recalibrating and thinking in a very detailed way about the process and what can be done to make it more inclusive. Some companies are experimenting with, for example, ensuring that there's a diverse set of people who are reviewing the applications as they come in, because it isn't always the case that anybody who has an idea can necessarily move right to patenting. There's often a process of review. And I think you also alluded to what happens when you make your first attempt and it isn't successful. What then is the interaction with that initial first-time submitter? As I think Lisa might talk about later, there are ways to encourage people to stay in the process, to persist through it, and to give them good detailed feedback rather than just saying, sorry, your idea has been rejected, but actually provide that coaching and mentoring to ensure that that person can move to the next stage and resubmit later. So I think there's a lot that can be done both in terms of educating the inventor, making sure that they understand and want to participate, as well as ensuring that the system is set up to support that, that can be done.
Thank you. I wrote some notes here for myself, just with some practices we could probably implement in the sphere I'm working in, and love to talk to you guys about this offline as well. Let's see. So Lisa, from a legal perspective, are there existing frameworks or regulations that exacerbate patent inequality? And do you propose any changes to address those issues?
Yeah, I think probably yes. I mean, we've already talked about how it's worth revisiting the standard for patent inventorship and figuring out whether it makes sense to say that the people who did the hard experimental work of figuring out how to implement an invention, maybe those people should qualify as patent inventors, even though they don't under the current standard. But that would require revisiting by the courts or new legislation. And as Colleen has discussed, we think there's a lot of much smaller things in terms of how the patent office is currently being run that could also be tested, including the idea Colleen mentioned of recognizing on the face of the patent people who contributed to a patent, even if they're not rising to the legal standard for patent inventorship yet. And as Colleen just mentioned, just the process of getting a patent can be improved to make it more welcoming to different groups. Currently, it's not a very user-friendly process, where most patent applications, the first thing you get after you submit it, you get a confirmation that it was submitted, and then you get something that's called a rejection or even a final rejection. And to someone familiar with the patent system, they know that that's the typical first step in the process. And usually the applicant then responds and says, no, actually, I think I should have this patent for these reasons, or they amend their patent application.
Right.
And
Right,
so
more.
that rejection is actually more like a revise and resubmit. But it can discourage people from participating in the process. There was one empirical study suggesting that about half of the patent gender gap is due to women being more likely to abandon their patent applications after discouraging replies from the patent office. So that, like, on average, women are more likely after getting that rejection to say, oh, I guess they don't want it, and to walk away from the process. So
Wow.
as Colleen mentioned, Kathy Vidal, the current Patent Office Director, is really interested in addressing this problem, making it more user-friendly. They're currently now at the Patent Office sending applicants a welcome letter rather than just a confirmation and then a rejection, to kind of welcome them to the system and tell them more about the process. And the Patent Office has done an experiment for patent applicants who don't have an attorney helping them. If you have patent examiners who are trained to help these applicants and walk them through the process, and kind of providing better education about like what's actually required to get a patent, that actually had a huge impact on the patent gender gap. Like, it completely closed the gap in application success rate in the areas in which women were doing the worst, and among first-time US applicants for those who weren't represented by an attorney. So there's lots of these smaller things that could happen even if we're not changing the legal standard for inventorship.
That's super impactful. And, when you say that women, when they get that first notice, that is a rejection, versus instead of pushing back, they just accept it and move on to something else. I wonder if that's kind of like because they're not an insider and they just don't know, right? If you knew, then you would maybe push back, right? So I think what the Patent Office is doing now with, I've attended a couple of the webinar series that they've been having, specifically targeting or welcoming women and other groups. I think it's been really amazing. It feels like they're really trying to reach out. And I wasn't aware of, some of the other things you mentioned, but I'm happy to hear that, that they're helping people who don't have a patent attorney and really trying to encourage it. So it doesn't feel like some kind of elite process for only people who are in a certain club. It's open to all innovators, inventors, to participate in the process. And of course, that's not to say that if you keep trying, you're going to get a patent, because it's very rare, I think, really, to get a patent. Not all ideas are patentable, and sometimes there's prior art and other things out there. But I think having the information, the education, the resources to try and go for it is encouraging.
And it's actually like a fairly large percentage of applications end up leading to some kind of patent. And I think part of the process for people who are familiar with it is recognizing that a lot of amendments happen to the patent application as it goes through the patent office, and that's a normal piece of the process. So like, there's lots of people who are doing things that are actually, there's some part of it that is new and non-obvious compared to what happened before. And you just need the right counseling and education to figure out, how can I write my patent application to highlight like what is actually new here compared to
Right.
what happened before.
Yeah, definitely. I 100% agree with that. Thank you. Let's see. So Colleen, the study mentions that many firms and nonprofits have committed to improving inventor equity, and we've talked a little bit about that. So moving forward, how do you see these efforts influencing the landscape of patent inventorship?
Yeah, I think that our work does not sort of it exist in a vacuum, but I think it is encouraged by and hopefully useful to those who have signed what's called the Innovator Diversity Inventorship Pledge, which commits them to look at their metrics, kind of figure out where these innovator inventor gaps are, and try to make progress towards them. So we're excited to be rolling this information out to those companies and to encourage them to take up these ideas, or even their own ideas, but really to work to think about them from a research perspective about what can we learn from this experiment, knowing that we'll try a lot of things. Maybe some of them will work, some of them won't, but we won't really know unless we set things up for for impact assessment, which means sort of thinking about what the control group is that doesn't receive the new treatment versus the one that does. And so what we'd like to just see is we're very encouraged by all the energy that's going into now trying to address these gaps, but we just like to see more rigor around them in ways that can also inform policy making down the way. And so, as I mentioned, we're working with one company now to hopefully launch a pilot that would allow for greater recognition of non-inventors. And we think that can then build the evidence base for PTO to do things as well as potentially law changes down the line. So I think thinking about this holistically, that a lot of the processes, as Lisa had mentioned, right, that even in the inventing process at the patent office, you have rounds of review and rejection. Those sorts of rounds of review and rejection are also happening often inside companies where somebody submits their idea and then it has to be looked at by a review board and teach each other about what's effective. I think is something that we're really interested in, sort of being that bridge between the two contexts, in which we sort of acknowledge that invention and innovation, it's a competitive process. You need to participate and then you need to persist through it. And getting that sense is now something that I think provides us with a lot of opportunities. I will say that, as a patent sort of empirical scholar, both of us have studied patents for a long time and looked at applications and what actually happens once somebody's filed, but there has not been really a good understanding what happens before somebody files. And so I think now that we're trying to get more information and understanding of what that looks like, we can see that there are a lot of opportunities to work with the current processes and improve them potentially.
Definitely. There are obstacles ahead of that filing, and you're right, definitely need to address those to help ensure people get to the stage where they can file. Colleen, maybe just to go off of that a little bit more, what are the opportunities for collaboration between researchers and policymakers and the industry stakeholders to address patent inventor inequality?
I'm so glad you asked because Elisa and I are collaborating on an initiative called the Diversity Pilots Initiative. You can go to our website, diversitypilots.org, and we are a collection of researchers that is eager to work with companies and others to pilot different interventions to improve the patenting process and address this gap. And we are working with a small cadre of companies now. As Lisa says, it's not easy. We have to kind of figure out how to design pilots in ways that will not interfere with the operations of the company, but will also allow for evaluation. But we've been very encouraged by the willingness of these companies and the desire really of them to see broader involvement in their processes. So that's our website. We had a conference in 22. We're having one in 2024. The one in 22 was co-sponsored by the Patent Office and a number of organizations, including Autumn and others, and we're working on those affiliations now for the 2024 conference. But there will be a conference at Emory Law September 13th, I believe, is the date. And so we encourage those who might be doing interesting project, sort of changes in their own policies internally to get in touch with us and potentially share their work. So I think we want to just kind of foster this community because as we've mentioned, there are a lot of parallels. And we can learn a lot from each other. So the hope is that through this Diversity Pilots Initiative, we can support more and more research in this area and use that research then to drive the impact.
I'm excited about your conference. So September 13th, I've made a note of that. I definitely will participate. I love this. You guys are doing such exciting and very relevant work. So I think our final question, so what are the potential long-term economic and social impacts of addressing patent inventorship disparities? Maybe Lisa, you want to start?
Sure. So I think they could be very large. I think there's good evidence that innovation is central to long-term economic growth and to addressing many core societal challenges ranging from health to climate change. And inequality is also a defining societal challenge, including inequality in problems like health disparities and environmental injustice. And I think these problems can be tackled together by thinking about who is innovating in an inclusive way to tackle these problems in a way that leads to both more participation, more equitable participation in the innovation ecosystem, but also, as Colleen mentioned, this affects the kind of innovations that you get. Like there's good empirical evidence that all female inventor teams are more likely to focus on women's health. And so if we care about health disparities, then we might care about like who is thinking about those problems. And I'll just emphasize, as Colleen has said, people who are involved in any piece of the innovation ecosystem, I think, can play some role in tackling these challenges. So whether it's a university or a private company or the patent office or the courts, like there's different interventions that could be tested in all of these places. So there's a lot of opportunity to understand better what the causes of inequality are and to make progress in reducing them.
Colleen, would you like to also comment?
I think Lisa's put it so well already. I mean, I think I would just also say that, you know, we have a huge opportunity here, as you mentioned before, if women, minorities, and people from low income backgrounds participated, we have the chance to quadruple the amount of innovation there is. And we know there's so many challenges out there that could benefit from more innovation. So I think both in terms of the quantity, but also thinking about the sort of missing star inventors that are out there. You know, we talk about Patricia Bath, for example. She's an African-American woman who's made pioneering impacts on, you know, on cataracts and on LASIK surgery. How many Patricia Baths are we missing by not having the full talent at the table? I think as we're in this kind of competitive competitive era that we're in right now, ensuring that we really have all hands on deck is really important, and that we can sort of look at both economic productivity, but also greater participation by all as something that we can something that can come from a greater inclusion and innovation.
Wonderful. I agree. All hands on deck. If we can help promote that and make that happen, I think we'll all be better off for it. Wonderful conversation. I will close now unless you want to make any other comments before we go.
This has been wonderful. Thanks so much for giving us the opportunity to talk about this work.
Thank you both. This has been amazing. I love the conversation. Looking forward to following up with you both offline as well. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope you love this conversation, and I'll see you next time.